我们总以为在中东这样的火药桶问题上，中国的沉默是缺席。但如果我告诉你，这种低调其实是一种更高级的博弈姿态呢？就在最近，一段来自法国主流媒体的采访却给出了完全不同的解读。一位欧洲经济界重量级人物罕见直言，中国的地缘政治地位远远高于他在国际舞台上的声音。换句话说，中国不是没实力，而是刻意不说。当伊朗战争不断升级，中国既是伊朗最大的石油买家，又深度绑定在能源与地缘体系中，但它却既没有军事介入，也没有高调站队。这种克制，在西方看来，甚至有些不符合常理。更耐人寻味的是，这位法国专家还点出一个关键细节：美国对伊朗的动作可能不仅仅是中东博弈，更像是在一步步卡住中国的能源命脉。从委内瑞拉到伊朗，一条围绕中国的能源封锁链似乎正在成型。但与此同时，中美之间却又在悄悄恢复对话，甚至准备高层会面，一个在战场上升温，一个在谈判桌上降温。这种矛盾局面才是当下真正的博弈核心。所以问题来了，中国的低调到底是无奈的克制，还是更深层布局的一部分？接下来，让我们看看这段法媒采访到底透露了哪些不一样的信号。
Now, the two sessions are unlikely to openly address the US and Israeli attacks on Iran, but is it fair to say that its presence will be felt?
Usually, the Assembly, the National People Congress, is focused on domestic policies. Of course, as I said, with so many people in town, so high stakes in the world with an impact for China. So the geopolitical situation is, of course, unsettled by the Iran conflict, and China and Iran have a strategic union. So China has a very difficult decision to take, as about expressing more than just concern, expressing support to Iran, which is not yet the case, or just watching for things to happen and prepare for possibly the next government in Iran.
Now, China is highly unlikely to intervene militarily on behalf of Iran. It doesn't have a mutual defense pact, for instance. But do you think it might provide any other type of support to Tehran?
Well, China is, in terms of international crisis, not taking as high a stance as its geopolitical importance and the GDP importance should be. In a way, China's geopolitical status, of course, is quite important. Its footprint is quite important. However, China's voice is not as loud and as influential as it's supposed to be, except in what used to be called Global South. If you now look at what's happening in Iran, which is supposed to belong to Global South, which is belonging to the BRICS, to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, you can see that China is, in a way, impeached by lots of weaknesses in terms of international relations, as opposed to, I would say, to what common sense would dictate.
Now, China is the largest importer of oil from Iran, and this is obviously something that there will be a chokehold on if this war continues. How might that actually play out in Beijing? What might the consequences be?
Of course, contingency plans exist everywhere. We do have contingency plans in Europe, and in China there's no question about contingency plans existing. So the common knowledge says that they, just like us, have 3 months strategic reserves to look forward in terms of energy security. Of course, Iran is selling 80% of its production to China because of the various embargoes. For China, it's asymmetrical. China has always been very cautious to diversify its sources of oil. But still, 20% represents quite a lot for China. So I'm sure that currently there is a lot of thinking in China about how to replace this source of oil. We have to remember that in this big game plan by the US, it's very interesting that Venezuela was first struck. Now it's Iran. And you can maybe wonder whether behind the attack on Iran, there is also another plan, kind of strangling China's imports of oil, knowing that, of course, China is extremely depending on oil from everywhere. And of course, this is a hit on China's growth. So you may think of a potential game plan by the US to circle around China's exporters of oil and look at what's happening for China in terms of growth if China has problems sourcing its energy.
Now, with regard to the United States, do you think that China is perhaps a little bit reluctant to go up against Washington when we've just seen a thaw in relations between the two governments?
There will be a meeting, supposedly by the end of March. So at the current stage and before the Iran crisis, the trend was rather to find areas of potential agreements. Of course, the trade war is still on. There's no question about the trade war being still on. But there is an apparent will to reopen the discussion, and as we speak, and in preparation for the late March meeting, there are some preparatory meetings between US and China. So it's not a G2, it's not an agreement on a lot of things, but there is still a will to keep at least a thread of talks and conversation between US and China.
Thank you very much for that, Jean-François Dumelio, Honorary Chair at the Asia Centre.
Later.
如果你看到这里，其实已经能感受到一件很微妙的事情。这场围绕伊朗的冲突，表面上是美国和中东之间的博弈，但在更深层，它正在一点点触碰到中国的核心利益。很多人会觉得，中国在这场危机中的表现太安静了，既没有像美国那样强势出手，也没有像一些国家那样明确站队。但问题是，这种安静真的等于被动吗？未必。从现实利益来看，中国是伊朗最大的石油买家之一，能源安全直接关系到经济增长。任何对伊朗的打击，本质上都会对中国形成外溢压力。但即便如此，中国依然选择不直接卷入军事冲突，这背后其实是一种非常清醒的判断。一旦被拖入正面博弈，就会落入别人设定好的节奏。换句话说，这不是没能力出手，而是不轻易出手。更关键的是，如果我们把视角拉高一点，会发现一个更值得警惕的趋势。从委内瑞拉到伊朗，美国的行动轨迹确实在某种程度上与全球能源版图重叠，而这些区域恰恰又是中国能源进口的重要来源。这就带来一个问题：这场冲突究竟只是地区战争，还是一场更长期的战略试探？当然，我们也不能简单的把一切都理解为针对中国的阴谋。国际关系从来不是单线逻辑，它是多方利益交织的结果。但可以确定的是，中国已经不再是一个旁观者，哪怕他选择低调，他依然在棋局之中。而中国的策略恰恰和很多人想象的不一样，不是用声音去证明存在，而是用布局去影响结果。与此同时，中美之间却在尝试恢复对话，这一点同样非常关键，因为这意味着，哪怕在冲突升级的背景下，大国之间依然在寻找可控的边界。这其实才是最现实的世界，一边博弈，一边避免失控。所以，从某种角度来看，中国现在的低调更像是一种耐心，在不确定的局势中，尽量不给对手更多筹码，同时为自己争取更多回旋空间。但问题也随之而来，这种策略能持续多久？如果冲突进一步扩大，中国还能继续保持这种克制吗？这或许才是未来真正值得关注的看点。伊朗只是一个起点，而不是终点。真正的故事是大国之间如何在冲突与合作之间找到平衡，而中国的角色也正在从低调参与者慢慢走向一个无法被忽视的关键变量。接下来会发生什么？没有人能给出确定答案，但可以确定的是，这场博弈才刚刚开始。